Hello, welcome to today's lesson called Pedigree of Thrones. Today's mini lesson will help you understand how to figure out the genotypes from a pedigree that shows us the correct phenotypes. Pedigrees can sometimes be difficult, so doing a pedigree map can be complicated, as you can see by this extended pedigree from Game of Thrones. So reviewing some vocabulary we've learned during genetics will be key to help us understand how pedigree actually works. So knowing what a pedigree is, knowing what phenotypes are, knowing genotypes and whether they're heterozygous or homozygous, knowing how alleles can either be dominant or recessive. So take a minute to pause the video, write down what those vocab words mean, and we'll go over the answers in a second. Welcome back. Here are some of the definitions for key vocab. A pedigree is a family tree that shows whatever traits you're interested in. Phenotypes are the traits or physical characteristics of the individuals. A genotype is whichever pair of alleles are inherited for the gene that determines that phenotype, which can be heterozygous when those alleles are different, such as big A, little a, or homozygous, when the alleles match, double dominant or double recessive. Alleles are the different versions of a gene, which can be dominant when only one copy is needed to determine the phenotype, or recessive when both alleles are needed to determine that trait. And in honor of the season premiere of the best show on television, our bonus word, Dracarys. And now a quick review of pedigree stuff that you have read about in your textbook. To solve a pedigree, step 1, you have to use the phenotype shown to determine as much of the genotypes as possible. Step 2, after doing that, you're going to use the inheritance as alleles are passed from parents to offspring to help determine any missing alleles from the pedigree. Step 3, sometimes you can't determine all of the alleles, so you might have to use a Punnett square to determine probability of any alleles that remain hidden. All right, for our first example, we're going to look at autosomal recessive inheritance patterns. There are other patterns that we'll do on future days, but today we're going to look at autosomal recessive. So, squares represent males, circles represent females. If they are shaded in, that means they have the recessive trait. If they're unshaded, that means they don't have that particular phenotype. The line in between means that those two have mated and are going to produce some offspring. In this case, there's 4. Of the 4, 3 of them do not have the trait, and 1 son does have that recessive trait. Now that we've established the different symbols on a pedigree, we're going to use the phenotype shown to determine the genotypes as best we can. So the first thing we're going to do is, since this is autosomal recessive, the 2 that are shaded in, the only way to have a recessive trait is if both of the alleles are recessive. So they are going to be labeled little a, little a. We also know that individuals that are unshaded have the dominant trait, and it takes 1 dominant allele for that trait to appear. So all of the ones that are unshaded have big A, but we're unsure what that second hidden allele could be. Now that we've used phenotypes to determine as much as possible, we're going to use inheritance patterns to determine the missing alleles, knowing that each parent can pass only one of their 2 alleles to each of their kids, and that each kid has received an allele from each parent. So the first one we're going to look at is we can use mom as having small a, small a. So any individual who has the dominant trait has to receive the dominant A allele from dad. Mom can only pass on the recessive A, so all of the blanks of the children have to be recessive A. We still haven't figured out what the father's genotype is, so we can look at his recessive son, and we know that one of those little a's had to come from mom, but then the other one had to be from dad, so we know that dad is also a heterozygote. So by using inheritance, if you notice, we have all 6 of the genotypes figured out, so we don't need to do a step 3 and use a Punnett square for this particular pedigree. Let's move on to a more complicated example. Now we're going to work on a second example. As you can see, we have 2 parents that don't have a trait and 4 offspring, 2 of which do have the trait that we're interested in. So the first thing we're going to do, since it's an autosomal inheritance pattern, we're going to put the double recessives into the 2 orange colored offspring. But we also know that the ones that don't have the trait have to have at least one dominant allele, so we're going to put an A with a dash for all of them. That's about all we can figure out using the phenotypes, so we need to go on to step 2. In step 2, we're going to use inheritance again to determine what any missing alleles possibly could be. So we know that each kid has received a small a, so that each of these recessive offspring had to receive a small a from both dad and one from mom. So we'll put those in. Unfortunately, we can't determine what the hidden allele is for the 2 unaffected kids would be, because the parents don't have easy to decipher genotypes. So we're going to go on to step 3 and use a Punnett square. Since we haven't been able to determine the offsprings that aren't affected by the trait's second allele, we're going to have to use a Punnett square. But the Punnett square we need to set up is based upon the parental genotypes. So once we set up the Punnett square, we have to segregate alleles from dad and put big A, little a on the side. And mom, we have to do something similar to, so big A, small a on the top. To fill in the Punnett square, we drop and slide information to fill out the grid. When we get homozygous dominant, we get a pair of heterozygotes, and then the last box will be homozygous recessive. Since we know that neither of the unknown children is having the recessive trait, we can rule that out when figuring out probabilities. So we have 3 boxes to count. Now, out of those, 1 out of the 3 is homozygous dominant, big A, and 2 of them are heterozygotes. So if we're unsure of what the alleles are, underneath we can write 1 out of 3 boxes had big A, and 2 out of 3 were heterozygotes. So those are the probabilities of what that second allele would be, 33 and 67%. Now it's your turn. Both of you will be able to say, now it's your turn to try a more complicated pedigree. So, after you've tried step 1, using the phenotypes to determine the genotypes, check the next slide to see how well you are doing. I'll wait here while you're practicing. All right, here's what you should have done. You use the phenotypes. The first thing I would do is find all of the ones that are recessive and label them as homozygous recessive by putting little a underneath all of the orange shapes. Once you finish that, you know all of the dominant individuals have at least one big A, but you're unsure about the second allele at this point. Go ahead and give step 2 a shot and use inheritance and come back and check the video. Now that you have your shot at using inheritance, I'll go through and talk about how I did the same steps. Since dad has little a, the only allele that he can pass on to his kids is the recessive A gene. We know that the big A had to come from mom, so little a is the missing space for all 3 of the dominant having offspring. The next we're going to try to fill in is the two moms, and because that they each had a child that had the recessive condition, we know one of the A's had to come from the father, but the other one had to come from her. So one of her alleles had to be recessive A, so we'll go ahead and put it in those boxes. Same for down here, recessive A goes on to mom. Unfortunately, since both of these parents are heterozygous, we're probably going to have to use a Punnett square to finish off this pedigree and determine the genotypes. So take another pause, do what you can, and come back to check your work after step 3. All right, we're almost done. So we have 2 grandkids who need to have their last allele determined, but because both parents are heterozygous, we're going to have to use a Punnett square to do that. So we're going to split up the alleles and we're going to drop and slide, and we get a very similar kind of pattern. We know that these 2 grandsons, don't have little a because they don't show the recessive trait. So that leaves them with 3 different offspring boxes in the Punnett square. And out of those, one of them is homozygous dominant, so they have a 1/3 chance of being that genotype. And 2 of those 3 boxes are heterozygote, so 2 out of 3 chances that they are carrying a recessive allele. So how'd you do? Hopefully pretty well. But if not, feel free to go back and look at any parts of the video that you may need to review or see a second time to make sure you completely understand. You do, however, have one last job to do. So log into Moodle, open up the pedigree practice problems and do 1 through 10, and we will be going over these problems in class. So good luck. Remember, knowledge is power, and your test is coming.